Welcome everyone. Thanks for bearing with us whilst we let people come into the room. And before we get started, I would just really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of lands upon which I am currently sitting, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation down south in Melbourne. Thanks everyone for coming along today, noting as always that we're paying respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledging that, of course, by adopting energy efficiency and energy management more broadly, we are being far more respectful to the traditional lands and indeed the lands that we're all on moving forward. So why are we here today? I'm really keen to host probably the nerdiest webinar that I'll ever host, which is Unpacking the energy efficiency scenario modelling behind ANZ and the EEC's Putting Energy Efficiency to Work report that we launched a few weeks ago at the National Energy Efficiency Conference. So why is this the nerdiest of webinars that I'll probably ever host? Well, simply put, we are deep diving into modelling. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Holly Taylor and I'm the head of projects at the Energy Efficiency Council. And today we are going to be talking all things data. So before we kick off and have a bit of presentation from Northmore Gordon, the wonderful leading Australian consultancy that's developed the energy efficiency scenario modelling that fed into ANZ and the EEC's Putting Energy Efficiency to Work report, I want to give you a bit of a sense of how we got here. Well, simply put, many of you may have seen some wonderful modelling from IRENA, not ARENA, but IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, last year. That modelling demonstrated that energy efficiency was or should be playing as great of a role as renewable energy in terms of our emissions reductions targets. And together, they would be delivering 50% of our emissions reductions. That's 25% apiece. Now, we were really keen to see what that looked like here in Australia. And indeed, ANZ, one of the EEC's industry leader members, was really keen to support its clients and the wider community with understanding the role of energy efficiency. So we thought it would be really useful to bring that modelling here to Australia. Now, there's obviously some complexities in how that's done. And fundamentally, we're having this webinar today so that we can unpack that complexity. So just a bit of housekeeping up front. Basically, we're going to have Huon and Hassam from Northmore Gordon give us a 15-minute presentation on the research. And after that, we're going to have a wonderful panel discussion with a few complete nerds like all of us that are on this webinar. So I'm really pleased to welcome Hassam and Huon from Northmore Gordon, who basically led the work. They built this model, it's a bottom-up model, built it from scratch for us to really demonstrate what the role of energy efficiency is. And once Hassam and Huon are done with their presentation, I'm going to be joined by Craig Morgan, Sen Wong, and the EEC's very own Alex St John to unpack that modelling and answer questions from all of you through the Q&A function. So we've got about 15 minutes up front of just pure presentation, and I would encourage all of you to put your questions in the Q&A function during that time. If you've got any questions, I will come back to them later once we have a panel discussion. And if we have an absolute abundance of questions, we will come back to them in writing after the webinar and email them out, the responses out to all of you with the webinar recording. So without further ado, I would love to welcome Hassam to give us a bit of a presentation on the nerdiest nerdy webinar that we're ever going to have. Over to you, Hassam.
Thanks a lot, Holly, for your introduction and for working with us on this engaging program. We are pleased to play a role in this important study that shows the significance of energy efficiency in Australia's emissions reduction. So to give you all a brief background on the study, this modeling was commissioned by ANZ and EEC to raise awareness about the potential of energy efficiency in Australia, meeting its 2030 and 2050 carbon reduction targets. This model adopted a conservative approach and is based on technology that is available right now or viable in the near future. So there were 4 scenarios assessed in this study, which included business as usual scenario, that is doing nothing beyond commitments prior to financial year 2024 budget. enhanced energy efficiency scenario, that is greater focus on energy efficiency, along with commitments prior to financial year 2024 budget. High electrification scenario, that is greater focus on both energy efficiency and electrification, along with commitments prior to financial year 2024 budget. And high renewable fuel scenario, that is greater focus on both energy efficiency and renewable fuels, such as biofuels and green hydrogen, along with commitments prior to financial year 2024 budget. The study highlights how critical energy efficiency is in helping Australia achieve its carbon reduction target. Given the current trajectory of Australia's emissions, it is going to be a challenging task to meet the 2030 and 2050 targets within the required timeframe. So the differentiating factor of this study is the bottom-up approach adopted to calculate emissions reduction achievable within each ANZ sector, which is different than most other studies we have seen. This included looking at real-life examples and utilizing years of experience to identify opportunities within each ANZ sector. The key measures assessed in this study included renewable electricity, energy efficiency, electrification, renewable fuels such as biofuels and green hydrogen, and CO2 removal, including non-energy emissions such as avoided emissions from land and agriculture, and energy-related removals such as CCS and nature-based solutions. The emissions baseline and BAU scenario used a wide range of information from known available data sources such as ABS data, AMO forecasting tools, ALP's Powering Australia document, and AMO's ISP report, amongst other sources. The enhanced scenarios are based on improvement opportunities identified in the ANZ sectors. The assumption is that renewable electricity will be covered under the BAU scenario. Enhanced energy efficiency and high electrification scenarios are based on the fuel type used for various processes in each ANZ sector and identifying potential for further improvement within each sector. Renewable fuels is based on published goals and was then split up by energy use per sector and known and expected applications. Remaining emissions were attributed to CO2 removal. So the more we can achieve by other methods reduces reliance on CO2 removals, which is a very difficult and expensive emissions reduction measure given current technology and costs. As this was a targeted study, we have applied greater granularity on energy efficiency and electrification. The study is limited with regards to other carbon reduction measures. So the figure shows the contributions from the 5 emissions reduction measures in meeting the 2030 target for all scenarios. So figure A on the top left shows the BAU scenario. Figure B on the top right shows the enhanced energy efficiency scenario. Figure C bottom left shows the high electrification scenario. Figure D on the bottom right shows the high renewable fuels scenario. So in the BAU scenario, that is the figure A on the top left, renewable fuels contribute to around 6% in meeting the 2030 target, electrification around 7%, energy efficiency around 6%, renewable electricity around 70%, and the remaining 13% reductions are expected to come from CO2 removal. However, in the enhanced energy efficiency scenario, that is figure B on the top right, the contribution from energy efficiency increases to around 18%, whereas the reliance on CO2 removal reduces to around 10%, and the contribution from renewable electricity reduces to around 57%, which is primarily due to a reduction in electricity demand due to efficiency improvements. Contributions from electrification and renewable fuels remain the same. We purposely allowed energy efficiency gain to reduce contribution from renewable electricity in the enhanced energy efficiency scenario, as we recognize that the 2030 renewable electricity target is a tough ask for the government to achieve, and energy efficiency has the potential to alleviate pressure on reaching 100% of that renewable electricity target, while still reducing reliance on CO2 removals, which again highlights the importance of energy efficiency. It is also important to note that the contribution from energy efficiency can be achieved with known and relatively easier to implement technologies. In the high electrification scenario that is shown in the figure C on the bottom left, and high renewable fuel scenario that is figure D on the bottom right, the reliance on CO2 removal reduces even further to around 5% in the high electrification scenario and around 1% in the high renewable fuel scenario, which emphasizes the importance of electrification and renewable fuels along with energy efficiency. So similar results can be seen for the 2050 scenarios, where there is even greater reliance on CO2 removal to reach the 2050 emissions target. About 32% of emissions reduction come from CO2 removal in the BAU scenario, shown in figure A on the top left, and only around 2% from energy efficiency and around 35% from renewable electricity. However, in the enhanced energy efficiency scenario that is shown in figure B on the top right, energy efficiency has a potential contribution of 14% in meeting Australia's 2050 carbon reduction target, while reducing the reliance on CO2 removal to around 29% and renewable electricity to around 26%. In the high electrification scenario that is shown in figure C on the bottom left, around 34% of the emissions reductions come from electrification and around 14% from energy efficiency. In total, the contribution from energy efficiency and electrification in meeting Australia's emissions target of 2050 is around 48%. Hence, the reliance on CO2 removal reduces significantly to around 21%. This again highlights the big role both energy efficiency and electrification can play in Australia meeting its 2050 emissions reduction target. Similar can be seen in the high renewable fuel scenario, that is figure D on the bottom right, where the reliance on CO2 removal is also around 21% and the contribution from renewable fuels is much greater. Given the complexity and costs involved with CO2 removal, either of the enhanced scenarios will significantly reduce the risk of Australia not meeting its 2050 emissions target due to reasons outside of Australia's control. So this figure represents the 2050 emissions reduction per ANZ sector and contribution from each of the carbon reduction measures to meet the 2050 emissions reduction target in each sector. Figure A on the top shows the breakdown for the BAU scenario, and figure B at the bottom shows the breakdown for the enhanced energy efficiency scenario. Similar sectoral analysis for high electrification and high renewable fuel scenarios have been conducted, but have been presented in the report due to time limitations and have been not discussed in this presentation. So non-energy emissions such as land use change and non-energy process emissions were separated out, as can be seen on the bar on the extreme right in each of the figures, as our focus was on energy-related emissions only. For example, discussing the emissions reduction breakdown in the manufacturing sector, that is the third bar from the left in each of the figures, major avenues of emissions reduction in the BAU scenario are from electrification, renewable electricity, and CO2 removal. Energy efficiency and renewable fuels also have some contribution in reducing carbon emissions in the manufacturing sector. In the enhanced energy efficiency scenario, however, the contribution from energy efficiency is much greater than BAU, and contribution from CO2 removal and renewable electricity reduces. Similar could be observed in most of the ANZ sectors. It can be seen in figure B that there are major significant energy opportunities that lie within mining, manufacturing, commercial, transport, and residential sectors. So I'll now hand over to Ewan, who will discuss cost comparison of available carbon reduction measures.
Thanks, Hassan. This is a physical handover. We've approached cost comparison by way of considering the relative costs of emissions abatement. We've created this marginal abatement cost curve, which compares cost of abatement to extent of abatement. And next, I'll show you a bubble chart, which adds an assessment of viability. To explain the marginal abatement cost curve shown here, the vertical axis is the cost per tonne of emissions reduction. The horizontal axis is the number of tonnes removed by each action or initiative. Anything below the $0 line on the x-axis is a saving to the emitter. Anything above comes at a cost. If you implemented a cost on carbon emissions, this would move the horizontal axis upwards and would make further opportunities cost negative. This graph enables us to prioritise the least cost methods of abatement. The values used are based on dollar value today and cost of technology today. The graph shown here stops at carbon capture and storage, direct air capture. We've separated out hydrogen options as they're presently at a much higher cost, and it distorts the picture. It would be useful in the future to update this graph with changes to energy and technology costs. We recognise the extent of the challenge in front of us, and these costs are likely to change, which may drive an adjustment of priorities. Energy efficiency and electrification for transport are in the preferred position on the left. They have a negative cost of abatement, therefore are a cost saving to the energy purchaser. Driven by cost, these are therefore the first improvements that should be implemented. Shown here is what we refer to as the bubble chart. The size of each circle or bubble refers to the extent of emissions reduction. The colour is the category of emissions reduction. Green is energy efficiency, blue is electrification, etc. The position on the horizontal axis is the cost of abatement. The position in the vertical axis is the viability score. This viability score is primarily driven by the technical and commercial readiness of the initiative, the competition for technology or equipment, and the difficulty to or expense to implement. Again, hydrogen has been broken out as it sits much further over on the x-axis. The ideal position in this chart is in the upper left quadrant, which is where the energy efficiency and transport electrification opportunities are located. These have the least cost of abatement and the highest viability. The large number of big bubbles on this chart demonstrate how tough the task is ahead of us. This and the previous chart are tools to guide carbon reduction actions on a least cost basis. I'll next move to explain the sensitivity analysis we conducted as part of this study. We've modelled two variations: the renewable electricity implementation related to coal retirement and transport electrification being delayed by 5 years. The number of years we've chosen here is arbitrary. The choice of what was delayed was based on what we thought was most likely. We've then modelled accelerating energy efficiency to make up the difference, as it has the highest viability and hence availability. Explaining the results shown on this chart, in the position A in the top left is the BAU from the modelling. The B in the top right is the 5-year delay. In the absence of any targeted alternative, the burden falls to CO2 removals to take the majority of improvement, which is highly unlikely to be achievable. Graph C in the bottom left is the enhanced energy efficiency scenario from the modelling. D in the bottom right position shows the impact of accelerating energy efficiency if the 5-year delay were to occur. This reduces the CO2 removal portion significantly, which would reduce the risk of missing the target. This brings the bulk of energy efficiency action forward and reduces CO2 removals to a more manageable level. To better understand the role of energy efficiency in achieving Australia's 2050 carbon emissions target, energy efficiency improvements associated with electrification is separated out from the total as shown here. Around 60% of the emission reductions in the electrification segment is associated with improving energy efficiency achieved by the technologies such as heat pumps. Overall, nearly 34% of the carbon emissions reductions in the 2050 high electrification scenario is associated with energy efficiency gains. This highlights how electrification and energy efficiency work together and the critical role energy efficiency could play in the next 3 decades. Before we conclude, I'd like to make clear a few of the limitations of this study. We did not conduct an economic analysis as this is outside of the scope. It certainly would be a worthwhile exercise. The BAU scenario is based on government commitments prior to the financial year 24 budget, as the modelling was completed in February and March this year. Specifically, no impact was included from the safeguard mechanism, as it does not prescribe a method for emissions reduction. Finally, our study assumes the government's renewable electricity targets will be met. The full list of limitations can be found in the report. Energy efficiency emissions reductions are the least cost emissions reduction measures Australia has at its disposal. It has been the forgotten fuel, but I think we've demonstrated that it is an essential component of Australia's emissions reductions. Energy efficiency tends to be ignored because it doesn't always include shiny or new and exciting technology. Because of this, energy efficiency needs promotion and support, and time is short to meet our target. To take these points further, I'll hand over to Holly and the panel for discussion.
Thanks so much, Yuan and Hassam. Really appreciate it. I think what's critical here is, surprise, surprise, the EEC commissioned some research that says energy efficiency is great. The good news is obviously there's some actual real numbers to back that up. So thanks, Yuan and Sam, for that. I would be delighted to welcome to the virtual stage Craig Morgan, also from Northmore Gordon. He is the Group Managing Director, my apologies, because Craig is now based in Singapore, but still operating often in Australian markets. Lovely to have you, Craig.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Would also like to welcome Sen Wong, who is Head of the Energy Transition at ANZ's Institutional Bank. Sen, how are you going?
Very well, thanks, Holly.
That's great.
Great to be here.
And last but not least, the EEC's very own Alex St. John, because I needed someone who was nerdier than me, or more accurately, smarter than me, to talk about this modelling. Lovely to have you also, Alex.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you for the backhanded compliment. Love them.
Just going to keep it spicy, you know. So I think what's really clear, the EEC and ANZ have commissioned a report which says energy efficiency is great. It is indeed energy efficiency scenario modelling. But I think one thing that's maybe not critically coming through when we're talking about this publicly is it's not just modelling energy efficiency, it's modelling 5 key things, which Hassam did a really good job at highlighting up front. So it's modelling what contribution carbon removals, energy efficiency, electrification, renewable electricity and renewable fuels are going to play. I'm really keen to hear from you guys all on the panel. What's your view of the role of energy efficiency alongside these other critical tools for delivering net zero? And Craig, I'm going to pick on you first, given that Northmore Gordon did the modelling.
Sure. So I think one of the questions is how it relates to business. And for me, there's no. I mean, we obviously believe that energy efficiency is really critical for business. In this particular case, I think it just reinforces how critical it is to minimising costs of the energy transition, and also in doing that, helping to meet carbon reduction targets. But we talk about 4 main carbon reduction levers for business. There are 2 that reduce the cost per tonne of abatement, so save money and carbon at the same time, and energy efficiency is the first one. On-site renewables is the second. And 2 generally represent a cost per tonne of abatement. Market-based solutions around renewable PPAs and buying RECs and buying carbon offsets. So as business leaders, I think there's a bunch of strong market drivers now for pushing the energy efficiency agenda. Governments have both carrots and sticks, investors, consumers and industry themselves, industry bodies are really driving energy efficiency as a key tool in the reduction in carbon. And so I think it's an opportunity for leaders to step up.
Awesome. Thanks, Craig. So Sen, ANZ, obviously pretty interested in how do we decarbonise fuels and gases. And from your perspective, why was this research really useful to demonstrate not just the role of energy efficiency, but also the role of renewable fuels, which we have lumped in together because the Energy Efficiency Council doesn't really care if it's green hydrogen or biofuels, as long as it's a renewable fuel. But from ANZ's perspective, why has it been really important to not just demonstrate the role of energy efficiency, but also the role of other emissions reductions opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. I think it comes down to just the sheer task that's in front of us in terms of getting to net zero by 2050. And we often hear about the debates around this technology versus that technology, but the reality is I think all solutions need to be on the table. I don't think we have the luxury, be it time or otherwise, just to to think of things in a very, very narrow sort of construct. So I think we wanted to help elevate the message around energy efficiency, in terms of its complementarity, to other things that banks are certainly very well entrenched in, like renewable energy financing, and more recently, I guess, the work that that ANZ has been doing around the green hydrogen space. And I suppose that's why that's a big reason for our involvement. Huon at the end sort of talked about, I guess, the urgency around all this, and energy efficiency is one of those things which can really address that urgency aspect to the decarbonisation journey that we're all kind of grappling with at the moment. And so we saw this as a very, very important exercise to demonstrate the potential to meet Australia's national emissions reduction target. And it's why we're sort of from a finance ecosystem perspective, we're talking about this. We're involved in the green hydrogen space. We're talking about carbon capture. We have our partnership with the CEFC to roll out energy efficient financing for SMEs. We've got our labeled sustainable finance solutions for the institutional customers. So, we really feel we need to play a part in all the various elements of the transition, and energy efficiency is going to be a big part of that going forward.
Then I feel like I don't even need to ask Alex this question, because fundamentally you've just said why energy efficiency is so important. So Alex, if you want to do a pylon on why energy efficiency is so important alongside these other solutions, or if you just want to jump straight in to why this modelling is so important from a policy-making perspective, I'm happy for a bit of both if you want, or whatever floats your boat, Alex.
Right. Look, I'm going to take a contrary view, and I'm going to risk being fired here. And I'm going to say that no, energy efficiency is not more important than all the other solutions. But what this modelling does today is it demonstrates that as we head towards net zero by 2050, we've got a range of solutions at our disposal. We've got choice, we've got electrification, we've got energy efficiency, we've got renewable fuels, we've got electrification, we've got carbon dioxide removals. And the great thing about energy efficiency is it plays well with all of them. Energy efficiency, as that pretty graph that Huon showed us, it makes electrification better. Energy efficiency helps us reduce the total amount of load that we'll have to substitute by renewable electricity. It helps us reduce the total amount of load that we'll have to substitute through carbon dioxide removals. So, we have conversations where we tend to have people who are focusing on one sort of technology. You'll focus on wind, or you'll focus on solar, or something like that. And that's fair enough. People got their thing. People got to talk about their thing. But for us, energy efficiency is brilliant because it works with all of these, and it makes all of those things better and cheaper and faster. So from our point of view, energy efficiency is a secret sauce. And by the way, one thing we didn't look in this report because we couldn't was at non-energy emissions. But it turns out if you apply energy efficiency principles to those sorts of emissions, process emissions out of your cement or your steel or whatever, will also reduce emissions from those non-energy sources as well. So from my point of view, what this report is brilliant at is showing that, think about energy efficiency, have it as a state of mind, and that will make every part of the transition easier and cheaper and faster.
A lot of buzzwords in there. Secret sauce, front of mind. Loving it, Alex. I don't think you are being contrarian there. Like, I think it would be nutty for any of us to look at the results, which clearly has energy efficiency being the smallest percentage, and saying it's more important than everything else. But it's really critical that it is very essential in the near term, because we can deliver it right now. And it, as you said, it makes everything else cheaper. So, Alex, if we're turning that to a policy making perspective, why is it so useful to have homegrown Australian research that demonstrates the role of energy efficiency, not just in decarbonising our energy system, but as you mentioned, decarbonising everything else? If we've got less food waste, we've got less energy going into the original inputs for those outputs. So can you give us a bit of a sense of how we would hope governments would utilise modelling like this, or more intense modelling than this, to support robust government policies and programs around net zero?
I'd be delighted to, Holly. I think as head of policy, that fits somewhere within my job description, so I should probably have an opinion on this. Look, overall, if you think about what the role of government is, it's about making choices, and it's about setting up pathways to get the things on behalf of society that we've all suggested we think are collectively important. And we've also sort of suggested that achieving net zero is important. So we've got 30 years between now and then. As Zen really rightly remarked, there's some urgency here, and we need to think about the choices that we're going to make on that transition, and we need government to think really carefully about where it's going to put its attention in facilitating that transition. This report really clearly raises visibility of energy efficiency. We talk a lot about wanting to have evidence-based, or at least evidence-informed policy. Well, here's evidence right here, right now. Energy efficiency is the least cost thing. Maybe the thing that we didn't really harp on as much about is that everything that Northmore Gordon have modelled in the energy efficiency space is available, and it's ready, and it's right here and now. It's very high on their multi-criteria decision matrix. It's ready to go. So that means that we can use this modelling to make the choices that government has to make easier. They can choose energy efficiency. You can choose to put some resources and some attention into that. And this modelling shows that that will give us really quick bang for buck in terms of emissions reduction that needs to happen. It also will help government in some of the other choices it has to make. So if you think about the policies we've had to date to reduce emissions, they're principally revolved around reducing emissions through carbon capture, through sort of land-based carbon capture, through the Emissions Reduction Fund, and through encouraging renewable electricity. Now, we're starting to see some social license challenges around both of those activities. There's been some suggestions around maybe some of the ERF methods could do with a bit of tinkering, and we're starting to see a little bit of pushback against the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure. So turns out if some of the choices that government has in those areas is being constrained, well, here we go. We've got some actual data which shows you here's a bunch of other choices you can make. The final thing I'd say is really important out of this report is the difference between what we've got going on currently, the business as usual scenario, and what we could have going on, but it needs a bit of effort. So business as usual scenario out to 2050, energy efficiency, 2%. But if we increase our policy ambition just a little, if we use the choices that are available to us to reduce emissions through energy efficiency, which is a low cost way to do it, we can get up a much higher percentage. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without policy. So that's why this modelling is so important.
That's a really good segue. When it doesn't happen overnight, Sen, ANZ supported the EEC with getting this modelling up. It's ANZ's put their money where their mouth is and said we need to know, we need to know what the opportunity is, not just of energy efficiency, but everything alongside it. Can you give us a bit of sense as to why ANZ as a bank wanted to have this information? And, how it is valuable to not just ANZ proper, but to supporting your clients?
Yeah, I guess there's a number of elements to this. You know, there's the awareness piece, the education piece, and then there's the contextualization of, I guess, the role in which energy efficiency plays and the benefits that it brings. From the perspective of our clients, you know, banks are very much incentivized, and certainly ANZ is very, very strong on this as part of our purpose, our corporate purpose, to shape a world where people and communities thrive. And flowing on from that, the various key areas of ESG activity that we're keen on, we wanted to ensure that our clients understood the value of all the different tools that are available to decarbonize, not necessarily just from a regulatory perspective, like things like safeguard mechanisms, et cetera, you know, will work its way through the economy. But beyond that, I think it just makes a lot of good business sense, really, if you can find ways to reduce the cost structure of your business, reduce the cost risk associated with running your business, and, you know, insulating it from all the geopolitical shocks, for example, that we've seen occur along the way. Sort of increase resilience of our customers, business resilience I'm talking about here, really, in the face of a lot of change. For example, things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the like. So you know, what we want to do is ensure that we can release more financing for less emissions. And I think energy efficiency is going to be a big part of that. Then there's the aspect around broader financial well-being. And, you know, I talked about our clients, but there's also our staff. We ran a staff webinar. It was 2 weeks ago, or was it a week ago? I can't remember now, Holly, but you were on the panel. You were a presenter.
It was 2 weeks ago. Our roles were reversed.
2 weeks ago, that's right. This is what a long weekend does to my head. We had over 1,000 staff join that webinar. And one of the, you never know how these things will actually go, right? What the questions will be. But one of the fascinating things was that our staff members were asking a lot of questions about practical aspects of energy efficiency. They really wanted to understand what they do and where they go, and what they, you know, where do they start in terms of the journey, which suggests to me, as simple a concept as it is, and as, you know, the concept of energy efficiency has been around for a long time. But there's still a lack of broader awareness of the tools and benefits that it brings. And so I think, even from an internal staff perspective, there's a lot of value to be had. And ANZ's a large employer, so, you know, to the extent that we can make a meaningful difference to the lives of our and financial and health well-being of our staff members, I think that's a good thing.
Awesome, thanks, Sen. I think what's really critical here is, for you and me that have been talking to ANZ staffers for 4 or 5 years now around energy efficiency and why it's so awesome, it's really useful to have some independent, robust research behind that. And this isn't just something that we asked Northmore Gordon to do. We asked a few smart people, Tennant Reid and Alison Reeve, to review this modelling, to say, you know, are we barking up a crazy tree of saying what is the role of energy efficiency? And we really want to point to some robust numbers. So kind of with that in mind, Craig, before I jump on to our first question on the Q&A, but I would welcome everyone to dump questions in the Q&A, otherwise it'll be me freestyling. Before we get to the question from Alan Pearce, which is a really good one, Craig, we mentioned earlier that basically the modelling is just looking at stuff that is cost effective and accessible now in terms of energy efficiency opportunities. So us jumping from that 2% to that 14% out to 2050 is really just doing stuff that we know is economically viable and we know is commercially available. If we were saying in 5 years' time, what's the type of stuff that's going to be available when we think about energy efficiency? Like, looking forward to technological advances, where can we see some of that opportunity which would enable the energy efficiency pie or piece of the pie to grow?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And there is a tendency to think about technology breakthroughs, and there certainly are some coming in the energy efficiency space. For example, high temperature heat pumps, or
that's what I was fishing for, Craig. Just high temperature heat pumps.
I'm glad I was able to comply. Yeah, but that's just one, right? And then there's potentially a whole lot of transportation technologies as well that are physical things. So you need to electrify heavy fleet, and the technology and the battery life and the distance and the range aren't really there yet in fully commercial and proven applications. But there's so much more around energy efficiency that is harder to put your finger on. And I'm sure Alex just beats the halls of Canberra with these comments regularly. But in all cases, strong policy, better policy, better leadership, and innovation in business models, as well as the technology, is all needed. So we focused on existing technologies, as you said, which had a modest energy efficiency improvement rate of 0.3 to 0.4%. Enhanced energy efficiency comes from an increased take up at over 1%, say 1.2%. So that take up rate is not necessarily due to changes in technology that suddenly become available. It's coming back to the points I made earlier: better leadership from policymakers, better leadership within business, and more entrepreneurial business solutions, whether that's a business model, retrofit programs, internal company programs, and even solutions delivered by existing infrastructure owners like networks. Electricity networks need to come up with better solutions to allow all this to happen. I was talking with someone the other day, and they've modelled the ability for the Victorian network to accept electrification of all households, and one view is that it can't handle it. So there is a lot to be done. For households, I think the march for electrification may be slowed by non-technical barriers. So individuals having access to capital, the willingness to spend, as well as those technical barriers I talked about with network capacity, or even worse, the capacity is there, but the solutions are implemented without maximizing the benefits or really optimizing benefits on their network for the benefit of, I guess, the whole system.
Craig,
the buildings.
Thrown out multiple different themes there. You've gone through like key critical tech, like a high temperature heat pump, which will improve. You were alluding to something like an energy management system, which would enable a business to realize higher levels of efficiency. You're talking about adoption rates in households. You're talking about our capacity to get access for finance. You didn't say it, but you're implying supply chain and skills, access and all of that. Like, this is pretty broad stuff. So you're basically saying, if we really wanted to ramp up, and tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm putting words in your mouth, if we really wanted to ramp up energy efficiency, we could. We just need to pull some of those levers that Alex was talking about and that you've been talking about in terms of policy and also business action.
100%, yeah. Across household, business, industry, and mining, the leveraging almost in some ways existing human capital infrastructure we have, but focusing on unlocking this potential. And I guess one thing that has come to me that I've really been thinking about in the last 6 months in particular, with all of the announcements that government's been putting out, and after doing this work, is that it's pretty evident to me that the swathes of government money, and it's not just money that needs this, it's sort of training and intellectual capital, but the swathes of government policy direction in some ways completely misdirected. So I think if you look at the leverage that government can have, or policy and all of that industrial infrastructure can have to unlock energy efficiency, which is much more complex than saying we're going to build electrolyzers better. Did I mention hydrogen? It might have been the subject of misdirected policies. But it just, I think the stark contrast between what's on offer for a national energy policy and some sort of modest transportation energy efficiency or energy framework compared to what's happening in some of the other spheres, it's a pretty stark contrast. And I think the cost to unlock this potential is far lower. And as we've talked about before, energy efficiency's ability to mitigate. I mean, the Net Zero Australia plan talked about $7 to $9 trillion of investment. That's going to be a heck of a lot lower if we can do energy efficiency.
Yep.
Can I just add something there, Holly, to Craig's point about the cost and the sheer kind of mind-boggling nature of the spend required to get to net zero, let alone to 2030. I mean, we're still dealing with the post-COVID hangover, really, of very, very high entrenched inflation, and it's not an Australian thing; it's a global thing, right? And so, in terms of getting to that point to effect the transition, we're being asked to spend, I don't know, the numbers I've seen vary wildly from $1.5 trillion US to $4.5 trillion US every year for the next, I don't know, couple of decades, 2-3 decades. That's a lot of spending in an environment that's already struggling with inflationary pressures. So we talk about, more financing for less emissions. I think this is where, one of the findings of the report was that, yes, we're going to have to spend money, but if you spend money on energy efficiency and the right things within energy, the range of technologies that, I guess fall under the banner of energy efficiency, I suppose you are able to enable the transition at a much lower cost than if you'd just gone down a particular route, say, just augmenting the supply side far more than you would have to if you manage the demand side a lot better. And I mentioned green hydrogen. I mean, the numbers are staggering, right? When we talk about enabling green hydrogen now, very much in the context of exporting renewable energy to some of our trading partners up in North Asia that maybe do not have the benefit of the wind and solar resources that we do, for example. I mean, that will require to export the same amount of energy that the LNG industry currently supplies. We would have to, I remember the Mats did some rough back of the envelope mathematics around this. You'd need to increase the size of the NEM 5 to 6 times, right? And so I see that maybe that's an opportunity that somebody has to pay for, but it would be a lot easier to get to that point if we'd reduce the demand side and optimize demand within the context of the local economy.
Which feeds really well into another question that we've just got, Sen, around what ANZ is doing to encourage SMEs to be more energy efficient. So you didn't really say the word in there, but something that you and I have discussed a lot is around energy efficiency's role in risk management, and the fact that energy efficiency enables you to put risk mitigation in around your operational expenditure, and that capacity to put downward pressure on your bills through reducing consumption. Can you give us a bit of a sense about how ANZ is going about getting that information out to SMEs and the work that ANZ's been doing more broadly with supporting business decarbonisation and adoption of energy efficiency?
Yeah, sure. So obviously we have things like the partnership with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is now in its sort of third round, effectively, to support small to medium enterprises with making lower cost energy efficiency upgrades. We have a wide variety of channels to disseminate information, be it through our various internet portals, through social media, through our podcasting, which I participated in one recently. We run seminars for our clients as well as internal webinars for our staff. And so we use all the channels that are available to us to push this, to push the messages across. And then at the top end of town, I suppose, through things like our labeled sustainable finance solutions, certainly when you're trying to design I guess, a package of ambition that leads to, I guess, for example, a sustainability linked loan or eligibility for one. Energy efficiency features very, very heavily in terms of what we call the sustainable performance targets, the SPTs. So it's it features heavily at the top end of town, but across the broader economy, we have a wide variety of channels in which we utilize to get messages across.
Awesome, thanks, Sen. Okay, I'm going to go back to our first question, which is really critically, I'm liking this one, it is a bit nerdy. So that final graph that we had come up, which was the enhanced energy efficiency scenario, and what proportion, enhanced energy efficiency plus electrification scenario out to 2050, and what proportion of the electrification was actually energy efficiency. So it demonstrated that about, over half of the electrification was energy efficiency gains. And I'm curious to particularly get Craig's and Alex's perspective on this, but Sen, feel free to jump in if you would like. This idea around efficient electrification and demanding that if we are electrifying, we should be efficiently electrifying. So Craig, can you give us a bit of a sense as to why that's so important when supporting businesses, but I guess the same thing applies to households, that we do talk about efficient electrification?
Efficient and renewable electrification actually as well, right? So obviously the grid is becoming cleaner, and so it makes more and more sense to get those loads onto electricity. In direct response to the question, I think it's from Alan, the savings from electrification can actually be allocated to both energy efficiency and renewable electricity because they're carbon savings. It's a carbon saving chart. So the simple example is if you take a gas heat pump, you could, in theory, make an electric resistance hot water heater, and you're getting the carbon reduction on a renewable grid, but you're not getting the energy efficiency component. If you make it an electric heat pump, you're getting both electrification and energy efficiency. And we had a choice of where you could allocate that. Ultimately, we just chose the way it was for clarity.
I think the simple way to put it, Craig, is we didn't want to be, ramping up energy efficiency like it's the greatest thing, but really critically, like, what's the number that we're talking about? We're talking about 40% emissions reductions from energy efficiency and electrification out to 2050. Like, that is 40% of how we get there with energy efficiency and electrification. So really critically, Alan, definitely the ANZ EEC messaging is those things are critical, and we need to say that electrification is efficiency in the same way that Craig just did, but I'm just saying it more emphatically because I'm excited about it.
Yeah, and I guess the other important thing is if you're going to spend capital and make an investment, you've got a sort of a double dividend by investing in energy efficient electrification when you do choose the right equipment, and which comes back to what I was saying before about having the right advice for people when they're making that choice, whether it's at the household or the industry level, and having the right finance solution there and all of the other infrastructure to make that the best choice that it can be.
Alex, do you want to jump in on that hidden energy efficiency dividend that's, in the back end of the report, but does tell that story around how energy efficiency is so critical to electrification?
I think, Holly, you would agree with the rest of the office when you all groan when I come up with hideous kind of portmanteaus. So I'm currently doing an electrofit of my house, but of course we're very big believers in electroefficiency. The federal government has
fantastic today, Alex.
Yeah, look, I think the feds, when they came up with the idea of energy performance, is probably a nicer way of capturing these ideas, which Alan really rightly points out. But it's the combination of energy efficiency and electrification, which is, massively more efficient. We all know that, an electric vehicle will have an energy efficiency of around 3 to 4 times greater than that of an internal combustion engine. It's the same thing with heat pumps, and it's the same thing the world over. But the real key, the real key thing for me is not thinking about energy efficiency or electrification or the other technologies. It's thinking about how it works together, which I think Craig was getting to at the end of his answer. If you're going to spend the capital, if you're going to do some work to reduce emissions, it's thinking about how you can take electrification and the benefits that you get from that, more granular control, a more flexible load or a more flexible system, the ability to couple it to on-site renewables, the ability to do all sorts of stuff that you just can't do with fossil fuel. And then also thinking about how can you make that as efficient as possible? Are we using the right levers in the economy to make sure that there's efficient equipment being put out? Is minimum standards driving the best outcomes for consumers and for businesses that can possibly be? So that's a theme that I think is really important. It's a theme that followers of the Energy Efficiency Council will have seen in the recent report, Clean Energy, Clean Demand. It's not about thinking about just one part at a time. It's about thinking about the holistic system, about demand, about supply, about electrification, about efficiency, putting it all together and figuring out how can we get the maximum results from that melting pot decarbonisation technologies.
Alex, I think that's a really good place to finish this discussion on. If clean energy, clean demand is telling the wonk in all of us, how do we best decarbonise our economy so that we do have an equitable and prosperous net zero economy? Like, it's really critical to think about, well, how do we communicate that to those of us that live and breathe this, and how do we communicate that to everyday Australians? And I think something that's really critical about what we've tried to do here is, with ANZ and the EEC's putting energy efficiency to work piece, it's the first time the EEC has ever written anything for a consumer, for a household consumer. It's just as much for a everyday householder versus an everyday business person, of really going, well, what does this all mean and how do we translate? And what's critical is this is just the first in 3 reports around putting energy efficiency to work, and indeed making sure that energy efficiency is the forgotten fuel no more in Australia's energy and climate debate. And what's really critical here is that we're able to translate the learnings from the wonderful research that Northmore Gordon's done. It's really giving us the numbers that mean we can justify the arguments that we're making to demonstrate to everyday Australians why is energy efficiency so important alongside these other tools that are also really important. So in terms of just rounding us out, I'm going to give everybody a rapid fire. Like, if there's one thing you want people to take away from the modelling and the wider initiatives, the Forgotten Fuel series between ANZ and the EEC, what is it? So, Craig, what's your biggest takeaway you want everyone to know about?
The biggest takeaway I would suggest is it remains, is, and still remains the cheapest way to reduce carbon emissions. In fact, you save money and cost. You save money and carbon at the same time with energy efficiency. It's always on the left of the MAC curve, and the easiest way to say it is you save money and carbon at the same time, and it's still a great positioning for energy efficiency. So
energy efficiency, easiest, cheapest way to decarbonise. That's Craig's main takeaway.
I could have said it like that, but I'm not
I'm TLDR. Sen, what's your main takeaway from the modelling?
Look, it's very similar to what Craig said. I think it's a no regrets kind of investment if you make the choice to go down the energy efficiency route or increase your focus on it. You know, it almost doesn't matter whether or not you, for example, and blasphemy, but whether or not you believe in climate change or the need to decarbonize, it actually just makes good business sense, because you are going to save money, you're going to improve the resilience of your business, and you're going to reduce exposure to shocks. And and shocks happen quite a lot more than people think they do. And banks are certainly very, very attuned to what that means for the risk profile of businesses.
So risk mitigation in a cheaper than other pathways option, basically. Alex, I'm going to lightly tweak this. One takeaway: National Energy Performance Strategy is about to come up. What's one thing you think this research is telling our friends in the Commonwealth Government to do?
Oh, look, what it's telling us is that energy efficiency is there and it's available and it's got all the benefits that we keep harping on about, but you got to do something about it. You got to have a policy, you've got to have some leadership, and you've got to make a choice to do it. So that's why I want the NEPs to bring forth some policies that will last a while, that will give us a framework so that people will keep choosing to do it.
So in order for us to unlock those low cost abatement opportunities and that big difference between BAU and the enhanced energy efficiency scenario, we need to ensure the government is setting up the policies and programs for the long term, and we need to ensure that businesses and households are aware of these opportunities. With that in mind, we're a minute over, and I just want to say a huge thanks to Craig, Sen and Alex, also to Hassam and Huon for the presentation. If anyone's got any questions, comments or queries, don't hesitate to reach out to us after the fact. We're always keen to have a chat. Thanks so much, everyone, for unpacking the modelling behind our forward-facing piece, and looking forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks, everyone.